I'm actually nervous, restless, because I want to be really empowering and encouraging and uplifting. And when you're talking about self-government and you look to the past, then you get to the pain that Herb made reference to in his talk, the pain of colonization. So it's very difficult, I think, to do that sometimes. I want to acknowledge my own history, and I have a name from the Anishinaabe people. It's Animkikwe. And I also have a name from my own people. It's Awahunde. So in thinking about empowering, I decided last night, as I took the elevator up to my hotel room, I wanted to talk to you all about revolution. And then I almost changed my mind this morning because I know Chris is indigitizing us. I thought, maybe that's too profound for the website, but we're going to do it anyway. I like that word, revolution, okay? Because it's about energy. It's about change. And I don't mean it in a negative way. I'm not talking about angry, aggressive, warlike, Ramboized kind of energy, military overthrowing of governments. That's absolutely not what I mean. I'm talking about positive energy for change. And I think we're in the midst of a revolution. And I think we don't acknowledge that often enough. A revolution in Indian country. One example, my history growing up, my family left Six Nations. We remained in the territory, but left the community because they didn't want their kids to go to the mush hole, the residential school in that territory. And then I was orphaned at a very young age from the sudden death of both of my parents at two different but very close times. So I was at least 20 years old before I went to a ceremony or powwow or a gathering of Indian people. I was about 25 before I first carried an Indian name, and 45 when I received a name from my own people. That's about the pain, you know. And we don't often give enough credit when we're looking back. We count the direct survivors of residential schools, and I don't mean to diminish at all what's happened to those individuals who were there. But residential schools had huge impacts on our communities and our families, whether you're a couple of generations removed or you left the community to avoid having your kids taken from you. I think we don't often acknowledge the impact on communities of residential schools. Picture your home, your family, your community. Now erase all the children. They're gone. There's nobody there. So it left a profound impact on who the people were and the relationships that people were having in our communities. And here's the revolution that I said we're in the middle of. My children, and I have 4 of them, since birth have had access to community, to ceremony, to tradition, to names. You know what? They're going to raise their children. All of you will have opportunities that my generation didn't have in making choices about how you raise your children and who they are. So in my generation to my children's generation, I figure we've gained about 25 years back. That's huge progress. It's a huge revolution. The second example is my brother, Dr. Mike Monture. He last week was at the Professional Development Think Tank in Saskatoon that FNG hosted. And he talked about our family. And he talked about, he's an MD kind of doctor, not a PhD kind of doctor. And he talked about his work practicing medicine and the struggle that he had. He said to me the one time, he said, you know, Trish, why did I go to school for all of these years? Because effectively I'm a drug dealer. Because that's what people want. That's how people define medicine. You know, we'll just run over there and get a quick fix from a doctor, just write me a script and away I go. And he's very much concerned about prevention. He's very much concerned about traditional medicines, and it's been very difficult to combine that in the Western practice of medicine. And he said, so I looked at our family. He said, because I wanted to find a healthy Indian. I wanted a role model of how do I get our people there. Well, he didn't look at me for too long. I don't think he looked at himself for too long. He went through the story and he looked back and back and back and back. And he said, I had to go back 8 generations before I was sure that I'd found a healthy Indian. Who we are, okay, and how we locate ourselves is very, very important to this mission of self-government, which I would define simply as having healthy Indians again. Many, many times in working with elders and traditional peoples, I've heard, you have to know who you are. You have to know where you've come from in order to be able to have any sense of knowing where we're going. We have to have our names. We have to know our families. And I mean our made families too, not just our biological families, because we do. We're people that make relationship all of the time. Our clans, if that's your way, our nations, and the larger relationships that those nations have. I firmly believe that the change, that this revolution I've said has already started in Indian country, has to come from within. It's ours. Okay? The federal government can't do it. The federal government tries. It can only amount to another act of imposition and oppression, even if it's a really good idea, because it's not ours. We have to do it. That means I belong to the Nike School of Self-Government, by the way. Just do it. I'm a little curious about something. How many of you in here have read the Indian Act? I don't mean a section, I mean cover to cover. Yeah, all the lawyers put your hands up. Well, I didn't actually read it when I was in law school. It was some years later I read it from cover to cover as a mission. You know, I had to laugh last week at the professional development think tank. They started talking about the governance powers in that Indian Act. And I think it amounts to something like having control over bylaws over noxious weeds and dogs. Well, that's not self-government. And, you know, the power to overrule. The minister can take away just about whatever bylaw he feels like. So you're not going to find the answer looking in the Indian Act, and I would hope that I'm actually encouraged that a lot of you haven't read it. You don't need to cloud your minds with the stuff that's in there. Although, you know, if you're kind of cynical and twisted like me, it can be a real hoot to read it and find out stuff about beekeeping and all kinds of stuff you'd be amazed about. But reading that Indian Act is looking out there for the answer. You know, and that's part that this young man here, you know, who was asking about what do we do about our leadership, who's, you know, they kind of shredded Indian Act for breakfast in some places, and they're convinced that's the sole place that our rights come from. I'm convinced they've never read it if that's what they think. Lots of you are students in here. You know, you look at the Canadian educational system. You know, where does that suggest that you turn to for answers? You know, in the classes you take? Only if you get to listen to the right esteemed professor? Only if you happen to go to the library and stumble across the right book with the answer, with knowledge in it? I don't believe that's where knowledge comes from. All of those things direct you to look outside. That the answer is out there somewhere, and through some luck or some miracle or some feat of something, you're going to knock your head into it and suddenly know. I don't believe that's true. I believe that the way Creator made us is that we have all the knowledge that we need to carry within us, and that's where you have to look. You have to look within. You have to know yourself, know where you've come from, to know where you're going, how you fit in your clan, your family, your nation. I want to talk a little bit, I dislike these things, about language. Okay? And we had a great debate earlier on. Actually, I've had this great debate in a whole bunch of forums about who are we? What do we call ourselves? Are we Aboriginal? Are we Indians? And that's the one I like. I'm kind of claiming it back and taking it for my own. Are we First Nations? Are we Native? Are we Indigenous? And on and on and on the list goes. It's one of the first questions students ask me, particularly non-Indigenous students in class. What's the right word? There isn't one. Unless you're going to use Ongwahongwe or Haudenosaunee, if you come from the Six Nations Confederacy. Those are right words. That's who I am. All of those other words, First Nations, Aboriginal, Indigenous, Native, Indian, they're all imposed words. None of them are our words. None of them express who we are. So I'm not going to engage in a debate about which imposition is less wrong. They're all wrong. They're all colonial. They all put you in the position of saying, not I am in a proud, strong way, but I am not really an Indian. I'm really Haudenosaunee. I was so excited last night sitting in my hotel room when I looked at your bios. And so many of you know that already. Someone said they're citizen, was it Saugeen, I think it was? I thought citizen, I like seeing that word. That's who you are. That's where you belong. Another bit of a blurb on language. This time our own languages, our Indigenous languages. Because I'm not a Mohawk language speaker, I've started to use language as a methodology. And, just like who do we call ourselves, when we're talking about this revolution, when we're talking about moving forward, do we call it self-government? Do we call it self-governance? Do we call it sovereignty? Do we call it independence? Do we call it self-determination? That list probably can go on and on some. So in struggling to find out about 15, 20 years ago what this call was for, I went back to language speakers from my own community and said, how do you say self-government? And I was really quite shocked to learn that you really can't say self-government in the language. Check out with your own people. And it kind of left scratching my head. Well, if we can't say self-government in our language, what's this big fight about? Why do I need something that I can't say in my own language? Confuses me. Another one of those words that at least I don't think you can say in Cree is rights. When we buried my father-in-law and we're standing graveside and we didn't have the clergy there, we had a traditional person there, Eric Tutusas from Poundmaker, presiding over the funeral. And we're standing graveside, and he's going on and on in Cree, and of course I can't understand. And all of a sudden he says, Aboriginal rights. Huh? And he goes on in Cree some more. And then Aboriginal rights again. In English, he says, and a little bit more Cree than Aboriginal rights again. And I thought, why are you standing graveside talking about Aboriginal rights, Eric? What are you doing? And then it also registered on me, wait a minute, why did you have to say that in English? How come you didn't say that in Cree? And I talked to him after, and what he was talking about, although this isn't necessary for the story, is that old man was born into the world in an Indian way, and we put him back into the grave, back into the earth in the Indian way as well, and that was an exertion of our Aboriginal rights. I'd say it's just an exertion of who we are. It was an exertion of identity as opposed to right per se. So I suspect then that you can't say rights in Cree. Well, where does that leave us then about what we're trying to do? I'm going to give you a bit of a long answer to that, and I want to go back to my brother, Dr. Mike, and his journey for looking for a healthy Indian. I guess maybe one little piece I should add in there. When you say self-government in Mohawk, because they'll always give you a word, even if it's not an exact fit, right? They'll tell you something. That word, not when it's translated, because the translation is self-government. When it's transliterated, meaning what does it really mean in a Mohawk way of thinking about things, is I or we are being responsible. It means we're looking after ourselves. That's what governance means. And I think quite simply that's what the goal is, so that we're standing on our own. Back to my brother. When he talked about going back those generations and looking for a healthy Indian, he made special reference to the veterans of 2 world wars. And in our family, we're very, very proud of our uncles and our dads. My dad was a pilot who fought in the wars. But he also talked about, despite our pride, despite the sacrifices of those men, that the participation in those wars did something to our thinking about who we are, and particularly to that concept, warrior. Okay? In my language, the law that governs us in the translated version is the great law of peace. So we are warriors of peace. I still have a button on one of my ski jackets from the so-called Oka events of 1990 that says the greatest warrior is the warrior who stands for peace. So while we're thinking about warriors, we have to think about peace. In the Mohawk language, the translation of warrior that I've heard from Akwesasne is the one who carries the bones of his ancestors on his back. The one who carries the bones of his ancestors on his back. What does that mean? It means a warrior is the one who remembers. It means the warrior is the one who knows where he's come from, knows where he is, and knows where he's going. And although I've just used masculine pronouns, let me assure you that I believe that women are warriors just as much as men are warriors. And carrying the bones of your ancestors on the back, the task being defined as one who remembers and one who acts, is not a gender-specific job. So in my view, what do we have to do? What comes next? We need all of our people. We need all of our skills. Each and every one of us have gifts. They're not the same. We each have to figure out what our gifts are. Having your name helps you understand what your gifts is. My Mohawk name is Ewahunde. It means the one who starts things with words. And when I got it, I didn't like it because I said that's too much responsibility. And my brother Mike laughed at me and jumped in his Mercedes and left and said, "You already do that." I don't get what the problem is. We need to acknowledge that there's many, many kinds of leaders. Our artists, our filmmakers, they're the ones who bring the spirit back. They're leaders. Our athletes bring us pride. Our storytellers bring us memory and identity. And of course, in this modern world, we need our administrators, our accountants, our doctors, our scientists, and yes, maybe even the lawyers. I'm really, truly not sure about that. I'm just not trying to make a funny. We have to be wily. We have to use all of those gifts to bring strength back to our communities, to be able to find the healthy Indian again. I want to talk just a little bit about Canadian law, and yes, this is the footnote on maybe we even need the lawyers. And I'm going to leave the detail of talking about Canadian law to my friend and colleague, Dr. Kent McNeil, because he's much better at it than I am, so I'm going to leave expertise where it belongs. But I want to situate Canadian law within my perspective as a Mohawk person. Canadian law is about conflict. It's about how do you resolve disputes. It's about how do you keep the world from breaking out into chaos by having strong, formal, how do you call that? Ways of resolving disputes that you can know, that are certain. That's what Canadian law is essentially about. That's the belief that it comes from at its core, that there will be conflict. Okay? I don't believe that's where Haudenosaunee law comes from, that great law of peace, the Guyanagoa. When you transliterate that word, it means the way to live most nicely together. There's a few other people in the room who've been to law school, and I don't know about you, but that certainly wasn't my experience of law school, the way to live most nicely together. So where those two systems of law situate their starting points, their values, beliefs, what's at the core, one is about conflict. One is about the belief that people will fight. The Haudenosaunee system is about believing that people want to live together in the way of peace. And that's what law is about. And I'm not criticizing Canadian law, because Canadians have a right to choose to do their things in that way. That would be the two-row wampum treaty, to keep your things in your boat. The problem is when it gets imposed upon us. So for me, the solution, what's a healthy Indian? Healthy Indian is an Indian living in peace. And we're not going to find that in Canadian courts of law, because they are about conflict. I want to go back to acknowledging the territory that we're in as a treaty territory. And when I moved from Ontario to Saskatchewan, I was struck by what a different place treaties occupied in the worldview of the First Nations peoples of these territories, the Plains. It's Treaty 6 territory where I teach. And when I first started teaching in Saskatchewan about 10 years ago, students would say to me, we have a treaty right to education. We have a treaty right to health. We have a treaty right to justice. I didn't hear that one quite as much. And I'd say, okay, tell me more. And the majority would look at me with blank looks on their faces. And I'd say, well, where does that come from? How did you get that treaty right? Tell me that good story. Many of them only had the rhetoric to hang on to. And when you're going to explain to me what a treaty right is, please don't go to the text of that treaty. This is where the lawyers can get us into trouble again. Because what that treaty means, as I understand it, has nothing to do with the text of that treaty. That's one system way of, I suppose, making it sacred or acknowledging it or recording it, but it was their view. It was their understanding. That text can't explain to us who we are. Only if you read yourself against it. You can see some glimmers of what that treaty means. And I want to acknowledge Elder Jimmy Mayo, who's Cree from Moosomin. I've taught some treaties classes, and he's come to some classes to help me. And the first time that he did that, he might have spent in an hour and a half class 5 minutes talking about treaty. Ooh, what's he doing? I thought I asked him to talk about treaty. What he talked about was how to be a good Indian. For a long time, he talked about Indian law, and that's what he means by Indian law. The rules to live most nicely together. It means the rules of family, of kinship, of obligation, of responsibility. That's what he's talking about. And that's what he taught to my students about. And I can be a little slow sometimes. Finally, the light bulb went off, and I went, it's not the text that's important. You can't start there. Because it wasn't the treaty that gave us those rights. It acknowledged those rights from the Crown perspective. It was an agreement made. Treaty 6 is about 128 years old. Well, our people have been in these territories for tens of thousands of years. Just think about that. 130 years compared to tens and thousands and thousands and thousands. Obviously, something else came first. And that's the inherent right to self-government. We're actually citizens of that treaty now, not of Canada. Because that's the agreement out here about how to live most nicely together with the people who came. I said at the beginning that I hoped to be empowering. I want to acknowledge the cycles that we go through in each of our lives, just as in the world around us. I want to acknowledge the victimization that our people have gone through. And victimization is a stage where you accept harm, where you accept your less. I went to talk with one of my children's teachers, and I asked that teacher, I said, don't teach my boy to be a problem. We have enough of those in Indian country already. Please teach him to be a solution. Because we have to step over that victimization. And when you're in victim mode, all you know how to do is resist. You know how to push away. I can push away at that Indian Act or other things that hurt me. Or maybe I push away at the people who are close to me because that's safer than, say, pushing away against a police officer or an authority figure. Resistance, although it's a wonderful skill, and yes, I think we need it in our bag of tricks. Resistance is only a reaction. It only guarantees us survival. It's not action. It's not enough. It's not governance. It's not us acting to be responsible. And we deserve more. Sitting here thinking yesterday and this morning and watching you young people, I thought, it's been our generation to gain recognition, and we owe Herb's people an acknowledgement for Delgamuukw because there's legal recognition of our rights in Delgamuukw. And that was essential. And that's why I'm not sure we need Canadian law so much anymore. That recognition is there. What our job is to do now is to build on it, to believe in it. And I'm looking to your generation to take us further, to build bigger dreams than my generation had the ability to dream. And I'm ready to move out of the way. You tell me when you're ready to go, and I'll step back. It's a few years back, my kids have been some of my most profound teachers, and with my son's permission, I'm going to tell a story, just a little short one about him. He was at another youth conference, and it was kind of set up something like this, and this is part of what made me really nervous. To stand up here like I'm preaching to you. I suspect that collectively, those of you in the room already knew everything that I had to say this morning. And at that youth conference, my boy stood up and said to the leadership, well, they had a higher table to stand on too. They had one of those, platform things too. And he said, we're already the leaders, the youth. Because I have younger brothers and sisters. And I know they're looking at me. And I know if I pick up a beer and spend my life acting crazy, that's what I'm setting an example for those behind me. So I know we're already the leaders. The young people are looking more at you than they are at us old folks, because you're closer to them. And I tell that story because I want to point out that there's a danger in defining leadership very, very narrowly. If we're living responsibly, as the healthy Indians my brother was dreaming about, then we're all leaders in our own way. No one call.